just give you thanks and praise for the delights of another Holy Sabbath day. But God in heaven, we ask that you'll continue to feed us with the principles of thy word and help us continue to be deeply interested and to learn more of your character, and also give us the ability to correctly and tactfully reveal your character to others so that they can be given life. This we ask in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. Thank you. So, as I said, we're just going to do a very brief recap to so that we are all at the same place with where we left off a couple of weeks ago in our Vesper studies. I'll share my screen. Okay, so essentially what we went over last week was a breakdown of the lines, and we tried to explore what fractals are and how they relate to each other. So we started from this idea that we have this big story that starts in 1798 up until the Second Advent. And for Ellen White, that Second Advent, she saw it as happening in her time. She didn't really have a conception of when exactly, but she draws 1798 as the time of the end, and then points to the Sunday law, the close of probation, and the Second Advent as key waymarks in that history. But as we recognize, that didn't happen. Jesus didn't come. And we get to 1989, and we need to break that line and start a new time of the end, which is 1989. But we still have these key waymarks that Ellen White identified that she's given to us, which is the Sunday law, the close of probation, and the Second Advent. And so through a series of steps, through methodology, we create 1989, 2001, which line up with 1798 and 1844, and we start populating this story. The reason why we do that is because we recognize that there's this long gap between 1844 and the Sunday law. And for us to correctly navigate our way to the Sunday law, we need to have waymarks along that way to give us foresight, to help us know where we're going, to help us know where we are. And so on this big line, if we tell this story from 1798 to the Second Advent, we have these small waymarks, 1989 and 2001. But if we see it as a new line, they become big waymarks. They become their own history, their own story. And again, we face the same problem where we have 2001 to the Sunday law, and there's this big gap, this big piece of history with not really any navigation pointing us where to go or where we are. And so we break it down and we zoom in. We spoke about what a fractal is conceptually. We tried to discover the elements of what makes a fractal. And one key thought was that there's a certain structure to a big piece of a story, a big piece of a picture, that as you zoom in, that structure gets repeated at smaller levels. And there's different types of fractals that you can have, but for the purposes of what we're going through, it's a fractal whose structure repeats, but the very minute, finer details differ at different levels of that zoomed in picture. And so that's what we see with the priests, Levites, and Nethinims. On their lines, the same structure is repeated, 1989, 2001, a Sunday law, a close of probation, and a Second Advent. But now when you start inspecting how those relate to each other and what we expect at those different waymarks, there's slight variations between the three different groups. So if I'm going to simplify it, without taking the statement out of context, the priests, Levites, and Nethinim line are just filling in the gaps between 2001 and the Sunday law, or 2001 and the close of probation. And then you have a repeating pattern within that. Again, you zoom down, and that repeating pattern is conceptually the story of Boston, Concord, Exeter, or a message is unsealed, arrives, you have an increase of knowledge, and then it's formalized. And so that's where we left off with this idea that the increase of knowledge between two waymarks and the formalization between big waymarks, you can see that between Panium and the Sunday law. If you take the small waymarks from the lines of the Levites and the Nethinims. So here, if you take those small waymarks to fill in gaps between Panium and the Sunday law, you can see that there are waymarks that exist in that history. And we asked the question, an open-ended question, okay, what are those waymarks? If we expect to see something there, how can we know how to identify them? I had asked the question, maybe not in the last study but a previous one, of what makes something prophetic, what makes something political. How do we decide, okay, this external event is prophetic? Because as we recognize, there's so many things that take place in a year. So if we go to the year of 2019, which would be the close of probation on the line of the priest, there's so many external events that happen, but which ones do we pinpoint and say, okay, these ones we can attach to that waymark? And so that's an open question, which hopefully we'll be able to get an answer to in the next couple of studies that we do. So that's a very brief overview. And if I know some people weren't there for the last study, so if you would like to go over the logic of that and some of the points that I just briefly stated now, then you can watch the previous study. But for now, does anyone have any questions? Does it all make sense of where we are? Yes, no? We're okay?
Yeah, it makes sense to me.
Okay.
Can I just ask what the DD
Sure.
is after the Sunday law?
Sure. So that just represents death decree. So when Ellen White talks about the death decree, yeah.
Okay.
So I want to ask a few questions about how we understand this little history. When we break down a story or a message coming from God and then being given by a prophet, what do we mean when we give certain titles to waymarks? So the first one, is a message is unsealed. Does anyone want to have a stab at defining what that means? You can use an example in your explanation or your definition. It's a pretty easy one. Just flesh out what we mean when we say a message is unsealed. Magda.
I'm thinking. Thinking. So messages, messenger come with a message. So it was the reform lines. Yeah, one second, I need to think a little bit.
You're on the right track, so think reform lines. What's there before the message is unsealed?
Darkness.
When we point to
So there is darkness, then there comes some light. And I guess then we going to second step where would be like increase of message. Where would be more light?
Staying specifically on unsealed, and the message that brings light. So would it be fair to say, Magda, that at each of these major waymarks, 2001, 2014, 2019, before those waymarks, there's darkness. So when we go to 1989, and we say there's darkness here, what is that darkness? Darkness about what?
No message and people are scattered.
Scattered about what? Like, what does it mean to be scattered? Do they not know, like, darkness can encompass a lot of things and it can mean different things?
Being in Laodicea.
So they're in a Laodicean condition. But there's key identifiers that make them Laodicean. So we would say 1798 lines up with 1989, and there's darkness before those waymarks. But the darkness in 1798 is not the same as the darkness in 1989. Do you agree with that?
Yes.
Are they in darkness about the same thing? If they are in darkness about the same thing, then after 1798, when light came, you would expect that darkness was erased. So do God's people then slip back into that same darkness? They don't. We recognize that it's a progressive message. And so whatever William Miller discovers in 1798 is something that was hidden from God's people, or they did not understand prior to that point. And then they get to a point of understanding what that darkness covered up. So in 1989, when Elder Jeff stands up and understands the truth and brings a message from God, what was the key component of his message that we were in darkness in relation to? We kind of spoke about it when we spoke about all these different increase of knowledge and formalizations and etc. Yeah, in 1989. We're coming out of darkness. What is that darkness? Natalie, I saw you wanted to speak.
I wasn't sure you were asking. The unlocking of Daniel, the opening of the book of Daniel. Your question is very sort of open, so there's no direction in the sense. So I'm not sure where you're coming from and what so I'm just saying anything.
What put the Adventist Church in 1863?
2520.
What put them into the 2520? And what's the 2520 related to? What could they not see? The 126, but what is it? It's time. And so they are blind to time. And so that's what encompasses that whole period of darkness, is their inability to tell when Jesus is coming or when events are happening with direct relation. So in 1989, when Elder Jeff stands up and he says, okay, I'm going to use time now and say that now is the time of the end, and the Sunday law is going to happen in our history, in our dispensation. That's dispelling the darkness that they were in before. Yes? Do you agree or don't agree?
Well, they always said the Sunday law was coming, but obviously, yeah, the rejection of time was a big thing. They wouldn't go into that.
So Jeff says, yeah, the Sunday law is coming, but now it's coming now. So they recognized that the Sunday law was coming, but they didn't have anything to base that when it was going to happen. So the reason I labor that point is that each of these waymarks, there's something that comes. Yes, Natalie?
Yeah, I was going to say, without pointing where the time of the end starts, you can't have a definite answer that the Sunday law is coming in our time.
Exactly. Emma? Emma, did you want to say something? Okay, Andres.
Yeah, so coming back to the question, if I may, about when what do we mean when a message is unsealed? Thought that came to mind was that, so we get that term from the book of Daniel, that the book is unsealed, and I remember studies in the past where we identified or argued about the idea that if the book was unsealed and then God unseals it, so if it was sealed and then God unseals it, that means that no matter how hard you tried before the unsealing of that book, there was no way for you to know, like, no matter how hard you tried or how hard you prayed, things that were sealed were like out of our control, out of our reach. But then when it comes to time, then that light is available, and then you can pray about it, you can do something about it, and you can reach it. So like bringing that to 1989, it makes sense for me in that sense, because if there was no fall of the Berlin Wall, no Cold War, no 1989, Jeff would not have been able to see Daniel 11 verse 40 in a new light. So yeah, just that thought.
Yeah, and that's a good point, that in this darkness, that God has this book sealed, or this message, or a certain aspect of truth that's sealed, and then come 1989, the geopolitical events of the time are orchestrated, they happen, and now is the point in which God's people, through study, through prayer, can now see time where they couldn't before. So it's specific. The light that comes is dispelling the darkness that was before there. It's arbitrary to say that the light that comes is how we understand how ice caps melt, because that's not what God's people were in darkness about. The light is dispelling specific darkness, and it needs a specific message to dispel specific darkness. And so that you see at every specific waymark. So we think of darkness as ending at 1989. But the mere fact that we have an unsealing of a message at each major waymark points to the fact that darkness permeates through the line. So it doesn't end at 1989. All that happens is that there's a specific piece of truth that we get more information about that sheds a stream of light in this darkness that, dispels some of that darkness. Then you come to 2001, and we have another unsealing of truth. And so if there's an unsealing of truth at 2001, the implication is that God's people were in darkness about something prior to 2001. So there is darkness. So when we talk about unsealing and a message arriving, as Magda put it, and light existing at a waymark, it's pointing to the fact that prior to that, we're in darkness about something, and God wants to reveal more about themselves, or more about the story that's happening in the great controversy at that point. And now we get to the next one, which Magda was going to touch on, is the increase of knowledge. So once this message has come and started to dispel the darkness, you have your increase of knowledge. And it's What is that? What do we mean by this increase of knowledge? What is it? Anyone?
More information.
Yeah, more information about what? Is it at a certain point? Tell us more.
Subject of the unsealing. We get more information on that.
To do what for us?
To change our character, to enlighten us on prophecy.
So it's very much implied in the words, an increase of knowledge. So there's knowledge that comes in this unsealing, and we increase our knowledge about that specific topic, as Natalie says. So this dispelling of darkness is not something that happens instantaneously. It's progressive because you have to increase your knowledge about what is being dispelled. So that's what happens. And then you finally get to the formalization of that message, the message that takes place throughout this whole period of time. It's one message, but it's being built upon. So after you've learned more about this topic, what happens at the formalization?
Testing.
Okay, so there's an aspect of testing. What else would you associate with that, Waymark?
You have all the points all together as a full message.
So this message in that specific dispensation is now put into a package. That's what you're saying, Magda. It's structured, and you've learned what you need to learn for that dispensation about that message. And so, Richard, when you say testing, tested about what, and tested for how long, and tested until when, can you elaborate what this testing looks like?
It usually creates a bit of a shaking. So as you get the increase of knowledge, there's a formalization of the message. Then, as you said, it's structured, accountability, then because it's in stone, and then all the people hear that message and they have to instantly decide whether they're for or against, and to go forward with Jesus for the next marker.
I like two words that you use there, is accountable and decide. Is that this message that you're learning about, it exists throughout this whole dispensation, but it's only at this point, once God feels or God says, okay, now it's at a point where you're able to make an informed decision. You're able to make an informed decision for or against whatever the message is, and I can now hold you accountable, which I couldn't do before. So in this process of growth that I'm taking you on from when the message was unsealed, I'm teaching you, I'm wanting you to grow, but I'm not going to hold you accountable yet. I'm only going to hold you accountable when I feel that it's in its complete form for what it needs to accomplish in that small dispensation. And so this testing happens from your formalization all the way up until we'll say you hand in your papers, as we phrase it. So the reason why I went through all that is because I want us to remember all these different aspects and what is associated with these different waymarks when we start exploring. So if we were to put the dates, (2021) and the Sunday law. So if we were to bookend this dispensation, this is what we want to explore and try to understand what's going on when we look internally, what God is doing for us, and externally, the external waymarks that are associated with those histories. So keep that in mind. And we'll refer back to this as we go through the series of studies. So switching gears a bit, I want us to go back in our memory banks. I want us to revise material that has already been taught, in recognition that as we approach the Sunday law, our message gets more and more refined. So just like how we have an unsealing of a message, God gives us an increase of knowledge and it gets formalized. That growth or that progression is God refining and pinpointing exactly what they want you to believe about them. So if we were to think of how we related to feminism, when 2016 comes, or should I say 2014 comes, we have a message unsealed, and then we learn about equality, and it gets further refined that we're learning about equality as it relates to gender, feminism, should we say, and then that gets further refined at Panium, that okay, we're learning about radical feminism, an even more refined message of what God is unsealing to us. So it becomes tougher as you go along. It becomes more precise. It's not generalized as it was. It now gets more and more tuned into the specific details of what God wants you to learn. So with that, we recognize that in 2014, around then, we'll say from the years 2014 onwards, you can be more precise, but the message is taking us in a certain direction from where our worldview was into where our worldview needs to be. So it's this move from how we saw the world as we'll say right-wing thinkers to how we see the world as being on the left wing. And part of this precision or refinement of a message is once we see ourselves as being on the left wing, as opposed to where we were on the right wing, in how we related to external events, how we related to God's message. It was all well and good for us to reject our worldview of the right wing, but that needed to be refined. And so we go to the left wing and we ask the question, okay, how do we know how to navigate our way within a left wing ideology or a left wing worldview? So I ask the question to you, everyone's to answer. Why do you think it's necessary to, we use the term sift the left wing? Why is it necessary to critique the left wing?
Far left, which is too.
I'm not asking where but just the left in general. Why is it necessary? Not who are we critiquing, but why are we critiquing the left in general?
You mean because it's not all correct? We have to sift regarding to our subjects of our message.
Mm-hmm. So there's an element that in this pool of the correct stream of information, you're saying that there are certain aspects of this pool that aren't correct, that aren't what God envisages for the society that they want.
Yeah.
Okay. Does anyone have a different answer or the same answer or want to expound on that?
I thought the idea was to help us, but also to help the mindset of the left be convicted, to become more balanced and hopefully, learn of the royal law when the message actually goes fully to the Nephilims. So the message will be, so it'll be clear cut. So they're on the left, but there's still a law, and for the Spirit to convict in areas where it's unbalanced and unhinged, if you like, for them to, well, I say unhinged, for their
Yeah,
position to be, for their position for their positions to be corrected according to God's purpose for that type of mindset who is not conservative.
Yes. So both of what you and Natalie have said, I agree with. That there's elements to their beliefs that if you were to hold on to, you wouldn't pass the Sunday law. So the whole point of all of this is that there's a great test coming, and as you get closer to that test, you have to become more grounded in what that test is going to be testing you on. So on the right wing, you can see clearly and evidently what's wrong. You can see clearly how the worldview of the right wing brings you to the Sunday law, brings you to ask for an image of the beast. But where do you see elements of that in the left wing? And so that's what you two are saying, is that there's elements of that within the left wing that bring you to that same place, even if from different angles or different positions or platforms. So this political spectrum, we, referring to studies that have been done, we went into the ethos or the belief or the underlying thinking that shapes the worldview of the left and right. And there were two frameworks in which you could understand those worldviews. What were they? On the left wing and the right wing subsequently.
You on about freedom over equality, or you're looking for something else?
No, that's it. So where is that? Where do you place freedom over equality?
So freedom trumps equality on the right wing. Trump is the definite word. And left wing trumps freedom.
So it's the relationship between two aspects. Is freedom bad, Natalie?
Freedom is not bad, but it's bad when you cross the line and your freedom is more important and you discriminate against others and hurt others.
Okay, so that's the description that you're giving to the right wing, and where the freedom trumps equality. Do you have an example of how that shows its face, how that plays out in society?
Well, we could talk about all the court cases where it's been freedom of the First Amendment, freedom of religion with regards to the cake shop and stuff, and it's all about their rights and their freedom is the ultimate, and let's not worry about discriminating against LGBTQ. So that's.
And another person, where do you see this idea of your freedoms as an individual take priority in society? What does that even mean? So where do you see that in its purest form? There's a specific political worldview that
Libertarian
champions this. So libertarianism. So this concept of your freedoms over equality, you see it in libertarians. Libertarianism. Do you want to be a bit more specific in what their beliefs are? Like, at what point does is it freedom to do whatever, whenever?
I don't think it is, but it's a fine line, isn't it? It's a fine line of. I mean, they don't believe they sound like. I remember Elder Tess saying, "Let me convert you to be a libertarian," and she made it sound really, really nice, and it did. And then we see the bits where it's still freedom over equality, still discrimination. So I'm not really giving you a good example, but they believe in certain things. They believe in the rights of gay marriage, and they believe in the rights of women and certain things, but freedom still trumps. I'm not giving you a good example of libertarian.
So you mentioned the rights of gay marriage. And we would say that the left believes in the rights of gay marriage in using how you've defined it. Would we say that these two positions are coming from the same place? That they see gay marriage as a right, but are they rights because of the same reasons?
No.
So what's the reason for having the right to gay marriage from a libertarian's perspective, and then contrast that with the reasoning for the right to gay marriage from, we'll say, the left wing's perspective?
Yeah, so the libertarians, they do believe that you can do whatever you want, unless you physically hurt someone or unless you touch into freedom of someone else. So that way they do believe that everyone can do whatever they want. So you are free to marry whoever you want. I lost my thoughts.
Okay, so now contrast what you've said with the left.
So yeah, and on the right side, you can have the same rights as other people do have. So that it's more about rights. I think I can explain it.
You're on the right track. So on the we'll say on the left, now it's viewed as the rights of society, the rights of people in relation to equality. That's what their focus is that human beings have human rights. And so theirs is coming from a position of equality within society, because those are your human rights. And the right is coming not from a position of rights, but I guess, as Natalie said, a position of freedom, which we said at the beginning is not bad. And so it sounds good. But when gay marriage was instituted, and as you said, Natalie, libertarians celebrated that, they're not necessarily celebrating from a position of equality. They're celebrating from a position of freedom, that, yeah, people should be free to choose what they want to do with themselves, but not coming from a position of equality. And this is an important point because we'll see it down the road of, one, how fragile things are when built on a position of freedom, as opposed to when they're built on a platform of equality, and seeing it through that lens. So does that make sense?
Yeah, it's quite dangerous as well.
So Natalie mentioned the far left. So we're looking at this idea of equality over freedom. And she said she now zoomed in at who exactly we're critiquing, who exactly is our focus directed to. And she mentioned the far left. And there's different people that, at least in Elder Tessa's Vespers, she brought up, that will say symbolize the ideology of the far left in one specific area. We'll say in foreign policy. And does anyone remember his name? And the news organization that he worked for?
Max Blumenthal and Grayson. Sorry.
Yeah, no, that's fine. Max Blumenthal. So now we've gone to the extreme far left and identified this person, Max Blumenthal, remembering that when we attach names to these things, it's not that these are the only people, it's that now we're going to use this name as a symbol of everything that is wrong with the far left and how it seeps into wider left-wing thinking. And that's where we're going to find what it is we need to be concerned about or be wary of. And so Max Blumenthal, and you said his I don't know if he's the editor in chief. of this webpage. It's what, Magda?
Gray zone.
And there's other people that you can list down in underneath this subheading. I just use him, as I said, as a symbol. And so these problems that we're going to go through are prolific throughout the wider left wing. But this is where you see it in its purest, most awful form, if you want. So anyone other than Magda, I ask these questions because about a month ago, I shared sources for us to go and review, to go and watch. So hopefully all this should be at the forefront of your mind, to be able to answer these questions. Is when you look at the gray zone and you look at Max Blumenthal and all the different people that you can list under that heading of the far left, what is the ideology of that spectrum of people, or that spectrum, that worldview? What's their greatest concern? What's their greatest desire? What do they want? What are they trying to address in the world? Emma?
Oh, sorry.
Andres, carry on. No, it's fine.
I was gonna say, they oppose imperialism and specifically US intervention in foreign policies and conflicts around the world.
So they oppose imperialism, and you're saying specific to the USA. And you mentioned something else. Did you say foreign policy? I mean, foreign intervention.
Yeah, foreign intervention.
Why?
Why do they oppose that?
Yeah. What are they fearful of? Why are they so opposed to US in this idea of US imperialism? What even is imperialism? Just talk us through that. What comes to your mind, Andres?
So I think they view it as when the US tries to intervene in another area of the world, they see it as the US being the sort of the police and trying to impose their ideas on other societies. And I believe the fear they have is that this core value of freedom that they have is being attacked or jeopardized. I think so.
And so in contrast to that, what's their desire?
They would desire societies to solve their own conflicts, or to have the freedom to decide, like, how do they want their societies to look like.
So each country should decide for themselves what their country should be shaped around. As you said, specifically the US coming into their borders to solve their problems, because there's a past that they're scared of. There's a past that they're afraid of, one. And two, just the ideology that the US adopts or has adopted in different conflicts in the past. So we say what they want is a multipolar world where each country is at the same footing as the USA, and they're able to make those decisions alongside the USA, not the USA coming in to make those decisions for them in toppling a regime or taking out a dictator, whatever it may be. It's that in a multipolar world, all nations are equal and all nations are on the same level. So if all nations are on the same level, who is the USA to tell us what to do?
So that's this. Not interfering with all the different cultures as well. I think that's
a very good point.
He wants to. He doesn't want all the cultures to be affected, to leave them as they are. So there's a variety of all different cultures amongst the nations.
And is that a bad thing, Richard? Does that sound like a bad thing to you?
If they want to have the names written in the Lamb's Book of Life, then they'll have to copy the pattern of Jesus. But every different area has its own culture and has its own history. It depends what you want to compare it with, whether it's a bad thing or not, because in and of itself, it's how they came into being.
So a good word you use there is that it depends. So if I were to ask, okay, I have a culture in, I don't know, Sweden, and why should Sweden adopt the USA's culture? Or why should Argentina adopt the USA's culture? We should be able to live in a world where cultures can coexist. That sounds like a good thing, yes?
Yes.
And as we'll see, and as we do see, the dangers now come is when you start critiquing elements of that culture that don't prioritize equality over freedom. So that's why we started at that point, is as much as there's a utopian wish for this idea of multipolarity, it starts cracking as you start exploring, okay, what freedoms do you actually have as a nation to direct and navigate the world on your own? So in contrast to this multipolar world, their fear is this unipolar world. And what is a unipolar world? Anyone? In the context of the USA.
One state, one nation, isn't it?
Sorry, I didn't hear that too well, Natalie.
Well, it's saying one state, one nation in control.
So it's in the context of the US, it's that you have a pyramid, a hierarchy in terms of nations, and your unipolar worldview is that at the top of this hierarchy of nations is the USA, who dominates world affairs. And who believes that in terms of the left and the right? We would say it's your right-wing politicians in America. It's if you want to think of a president who has that idea, it's perfectly personified in Ronald Reagan in this idea of US dominance. There's different terms that you can give it. US essentialism.
UN.
Yeah, go on.
I mean, when you think about it, it's going to be everyone, because it's going to be the UN and they're all going to agree to it. The UN, America's going to be in charge.
Yeah. Sorry. So in contrast to this US in charge that you've said, Natalie, the gray zone want this multipolar world with, they don't want the US coming into your Middle Eastern countries or your North African countries like Egypt to conduct regime change and topple Gaddafi, or in South American countries, it's no bastion United States meddling in other countries' politics. And it's this strong opposition, just summarizing what everyone said, of Western imperialism. The US and the West building an empire over the world. And this is born out of fear of what happened in Iraq, what happened in Afghanistan. And so they want to hold the US responsible for their hypocrisy, or their idea, or their take of hypocrisy in foreign policy.
It says the 10 kings who had no kingdom as of yet shall reign with power for 1 hour. So they'll co-rule. And even though America's economy has been up there for the last 50 years as #1 economy over the whole globe, they will be co-ruling when it changes to the 7th head.
So you're pointing out that during the Sunday Law period, that there's a change in the makeup or the direction of the United States, and in this worldview, of the right, it takes its final form, if you want to say, of America co-rule. Okay, that's a different study, but I would ask co-ruling with who and with whom, because in a unipolar world, there's no co-ruling. It's unipolar because there's one on top.
Yeah, well, that's still to be identified exactly who, but it's clear in, is it Revelation 17, that they have no crowns, but shall reign 1 hour with power with the beast.
Papacy.
Well, it's going to be the liberal ideology of the Jesuit Francis, isn't it? Which is going to geographically spread all over, but there'll still be different independent rulers, though there'll only be one king of the north, and it will get to a stage where those co-ruling would have had enough.
Okay, yeah. So just to draw us back to this idea of unipolarity and multipolarity, and the problem that the far left, represented by the Grey Zone, Max Blumenthal, Ben Norton, whoever you want to put in that bucket, is a fear on the US or the West building an empire around the world, going into other nations and dominating their ways of life. And so this is where the dangers start slipping in.
It is.
Yeah. Someone said my name.
Yeah, I was just going to say, it sounds like, you know, the king of the south, Russia, has the same issues as the left, right, the extreme left, because they think we don't want America ruining our way of life. Who do they think they are? And they're hypocrites and they interfere and blah blah blah. So isn't it strange that the far and the left kind of have the similar ideology as Russia?
And that's where we're going, is this fear that the far left has leads this support of a multipolar world, and this fear of US imperialism leads those on the far left to end up supporting, like you're saying, figures like Putin or Assad in Syria or Maduro in Venezuela.
Exactly.
And so I remember when the war first started in Ukraine, there were arguments being made about surely Russia does have a say. They do have a point in their accusations to America. So one of the key arguments is that Putin, this is simplified, but Putin/Russia argues that NATO keeps expanding their borders, coming closer, NATO/America, recognizing that the West and America are bedfellows. So NATO/America keeps expanding and crouching in on us, Russia. And so Russia feels under threat. And so to push back on that threat, it's only right that we rebuff those borders. Doesn't that sound reasonable? That Russia are scared, Putin is scared because NATO keeps coming closer, and what's stopping NATO from going into Russia's borders and taking over? What's stopping the US from expanding their empire? Does anyone recall those arguments of justifying Russia's response to NATO's expansion?
I can sympathize on that point.
So it's this fear of US imperialism. And so hence why you get, I think it was you, Natalie, you get Putin and those on the far left agreeing for different reasons, but agreeing nonetheless, because they see the US empire building as a danger. But it all goes back to what we stated at the beginning, is how do we relate to, and where do we view equality in the story? A common thread that you see in far left thinking in support of these regimes is a denial of irrefutable facts regarding different human rights abuses by these authoritarian regimes. For instance, there's some authors or some thought leaders on the far left that deny whether Assad used chemical weapons in Syria, whether the Uyghur genocide in China actually occurs. And the whole thought process is this conspiratorial thinking that the US, in wanting to stop China from rising up and taking the United States' place, injects this conspiracy of a Uyghur genocide, or injects this idea that Russia want to take over Europe. And so this is all US orchestrated to make sure that Russia or China, Syria as a proxy of Russia, don't take the United States' place. And when that fear exhibits itself, as I said, it denies just basic human rights abuses. Uyghur population, the genocide that happens in Syria against populations through chemical warfare. And so you have Tucker Carlson on the right wing, who will support Putin and Russia. And then you have the far left support Putin and Russia as well. But an important point is, in this support of your authoritarians, we'll say Putin, just to symbolize your authoritarian regimes, is that your far left are going to support Putin and say, Putin, you have a leg to stand on, because America can't keep getting away with it, and their empire building. And then you have the far right, or we'll just say the right wing for now, supporting Putin as well. But they're supporting Putin for different reasons. And as we close in the next few minutes, we'll explore those different reasons. But for now, I just wanted to quote something about the left wing from a source. It says, reading, left-wing support for authoritarian regimes is not new. It's not a new phenomenon. In the past, notable figures like Noam Chomsky, who was a left-wing, someone of the left-wing, a thought leader, and Alexander Cockburn, another thought leader on the far left, have questioned the scale of atrocities committed by Rouge and Stalin. These positions have generally been rooted in anti-imperialism and a deep suspicion of America's dominance in global affairs. So it's this, again, suspicion and fear that America is going to take over the world. And that fear leads to the denial of human rights abuses. Being so against the USA under this idea of multinationalism or multipolarity can lead to this way of thinking. Carrying on in the quote, it says, many on the US left take issue with a hegemonic position occupied by their country, a total dominance position occupied by the USA. But very few end up defending Assad's bombing of the Syrian people or Xi Jinping's mass incarceration of religious and ethnic minorities. However, publications such as The Grey Zone function on a purely ideological level. So they have an ideology that backs their support of Assad, your Putin's, your Xi Jinping's, based on a desire for a multipolar world where China and the USA are equals, where Russia, China, the USA are equals, in which global military, cultural, and economic power is distributed among multiple nation states, not just the USA. And Western influence greatly diminishes. And so they've been quick to argue on behalf of authoritarian regimes as China and Syria. So all that we're getting from that is that in this desire and in this want of a multipolar world, it's easy to take one step from that desire to then deny atrocities committed by authoritarian regimes. Because who's the real problem? It's not your Putins, it's not your Xi Jinpings, it's not your Assads, it's America. America wanting to expand their empire. So, in summary, just bringing the different thoughts that we've discussed today together, there's three key points that I guess we can take away from this. Is number one, when we start viewing the left wing and the right wing, we recognize that the right wing prioritizes freedom over equality, and that embeds their desire for a unilateral world, for America, freedom to flex their muscles takes precedence over equality. Want the USA to have their freedom, to build their military powers, to be the king nation at the expense of, as I said, equality over other nations. And then when you go to the left wing and you look for the multipolar world, if you don't keep a grip on true equality, you start to see what happens with these support of these authoritarian regimes. So your Tucker Carlson's on the far right, and his worldview is coming from a different position than those on the far left, even though they end up supporting similar figures or supporting similar regimes. So I started off by saying, when we looked at feminism and we saw our progression in understanding what feminism was, we had to refine that message over time to get to a point where we understood that, hold on, within feminism, there's different ways in which people view what feminism is. Is feminism a cultural thing where women have their roles in society, men have their roles in society, and women should be respected for their roles that they play, personified or not personified, sorry, easily shown in the counterfeit or the Catholic Church. Someone sent an article into the media, not media book, into Bible study of Pope Francis asking for theologians to try and get women more involved into the church. And that's coming from a position that women have a role and we should be glorifying their role in the church. Or is it liberal feminism that everyone has their choices and everyone is free to make those choices regardless of how it impacts the next person? And we come to the position of saying, no, there's a sector of thought of what feminism is, and that's the niche that is our message. So we got more and more refined, and that's the same with our worldview and foreign policy and the left. We get more and more refined as you go along. So if we're going to prioritize equality over freedom, we on the left need to be sure about how we're going to do that. And that's what we're doing now, is how do we prioritize equality over freedom? It's good to say that in theory, but what does that look like in practice? So we'll end there for today. And then next week, we'll pick up dissecting more and more about this multipolar worldview and a look at the right and compare and contrast two schools of thought on the right. If you want, you can go and look up neoconservatives and paleoconservatives, either by watching the presentations that were already done by Altates or by your own exploring of what that is. And that's going to help us compare and contrast the left and schools of thought on the left. This is all, in my mind, building up to trying to understand, if we can keep this in our minds, what this process of a message being unsealed, us learning more about that message, and the formalization, remembering that the formalization is not arbitrary. it's related to that increase of knowledge. And what you see internally and externally needs to reflect that. So yeah, does anyone have any questions?
Thank you. Only that every dispensation is different. So
yeah, exactly.
2021 is different from before 2021.
It is. With the caveat that it depends what story you're looking at. Because on the line of the 144,000, for instance, that's still part of the same story. Between here and here, that's still one message. If you're looking at a micro fractal, then sure, it does look different, but it's all part of this building progressive message from 1989 up until the close of probation, up until the second advent. It's just building blocks on top of each other. Everything is interconnected. So I agree with you. As much as it's different, it's also the same.
Yeah, I was just talking about, if you go down with your drawing, you put 2021 Sunday law. So you were talking about the micro level. I was different.
Yeah, I agree. And remembering that whatever the message is dispelling darkness dispelling the darkness that there was before that. So in layman's terms, we were ignorant about something, and now we're more knowledgeable about that thing that we were ignorant about. And it's all contained within that specific dispensation.
Yep.
If there's no other questions, then we can close with a word of prayer.
Getting sad.
Oh, sorry, I was on mute. Dear God, thank you for continually dispelling the darkness that exists by unsealing messages to progress our understanding of who you are, progress our understanding of the great controversy. I pray and ask that you may be with us as we investigate where we are in the story, and not only where we are, but how we're going to look at where we are so that we can make informed decisions about what is right and wrong, knowing that you hold us accountable at those junctures. I pray and ask that as we critique the left wing, we may do so diligently so we can have a basis of our faith. I think that's the thing that resonates most with me in the movement, in the message, is that you are giving us a basis for what we believe. And without evidence, faith it doesn't hold. And you are giving us that evidence through teaching us the different things as we go along. So please be with us throughout the rest of the Sabbath. May the Sabbath that we have be a blessing to us, to the studies that we do. And I pray all this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Can we stop the recording?